All right, good morning and welcome everyone to our Southwest Grassfed Livestock Alliance Supply Chain Primer. It's a bit of a mouthful. We're happy to be here today as part of the Regenerate Conference. This is a workshop that we are doing as part of a series that SWGLA, that's the acronym for Southwest Grassfed Livestock Alliance, has been doing for the last couple of years, focused on pretty much all of the fundamentals of the entire moment from post-harvest to marketing your meat. And it's called our Bringing Meat to Market series. And so this is something that we presented last year at Regenerate, and we're happy to bring it to y'all again today. We've got a super packed set of curriculum today and next week, and excited to have all of you here. So we're just going to dive right in. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So thanks for joining us. All right, so who are we? Southwest Grassfed Livestock Alliance, mentioned that already. We have a speaker here today as well with me, Rebecca Thistilethwaite from the Niche Meat Processors Assistance Network. Next week, we're going to be joined by Holly Zink from Sunnyside Meats, processor and meat market in Durango, Colorado. And our partners today are SWGLA as well as MPAN and the Western Meat School. So thanks to Rebecca and MPAN for joining us on developing some of this content. And we're being brought to you today by the No Regrets Initiative, which is a part of the Globetrotter Foundation. And I am Olivia. I am joining you from overseas. I am not in the States right now, but I'm from California. I'm an educator and a consultant. I work primarily with farms and ranches and nonprofit organizations that service them. And I teach and I coach and I do technical assistance and I work one-on-one with businesses, primarily on all of the really sexy back end part of business that no one likes to think about. I really like to think about, especially with livestock producers. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping here. We are going to be using your chat feature as much as possible today. That is going to be the home for any of your thoughts as well as your questions. And we're going to ask you to actually hold your questions until we get to Q&A moments. So I will prompt you in that moment and let you know when to start typing in your questions. For most of the sections, we'll have a little dedicated Q&A. We're also going to use the raise your hand feature. We're going to practice it pretty soon, where you can hold your hand up and one of us will call on you and you can unmute yourself and start speaking for actual live questions. And then we're going to do some breakout rooms today. I really wanted to try and create a few opportunities, both today and next week, where you can get to know each other and talk shop and talk about some of the themes that we'll be talking about, but also be free to really let conversation guide you wherever it goes. And inside of those breakout rooms, we'll be asking you to assign spokespeople that will report back to the group some of the information that y'all exchanged with each other. So here on the screen, you see some basic guidelines that Quivira has given us. Take a minute, take a look at them. I'm not going to read through them, but basically this is about good courtesy inside of a virtual experience, not that different than what it would be like in a real life experience. And we just ask that you use, good manners across the board and are careful in how you approach the group inside of those participatory moments. So I want to take a minute and ask you to close the other windows in your screen, on your computer, on your phone, silence your phone. Go ahead and get some extra coffee and some water. And we're going to take just 3 deep breaths to ground into this moment. It is an incredibly distracting time in life everywhere for all that's going on. And I really deeply appreciate you all dedicating your time to this workshop, but I thought it might help us in getting grounded with a little bit of just breathing. So we're going to just take 3 deep breaths and you can feel free to close your eyes and inhale And exhale out all of our distractions. Inhale. And exhale. Last one, inhale. And exhale. So hopefully that helps us all be here today. And I'd love to start with a little bit of the chat and practice participating. And type into the chat one thing you hope to learn from this course. You can also let us know what supply chain means to you. I'd love to see who's currently processing meat and who is not yet processing and here to learn about processing. That means that maybe you are a new business, or maybe you're just a livestock producer and you're not actually producing meat. So take a minute and chat it up in there. I'm gonna While y'all are doing that, I'm going to keep moving and talk a little about why we're here. So why this workshop? We recognized a need for producers to better understand really each step in getting their meat to market. And especially at soil-based conferences, we found that it wasn't anything that was really, common. There's a lot of training out there in this area, but not as many at conferences like Regenerate. So this class focuses on the middle of the supply chain, really from harvest to package. We're not covering specific marketing tactics. We're not covering things about production. We're not covering animal husbandry. We're not covering the cost of production. So we have a lot of other SWGLA resources that touch on all of these things. And I wanted to point you to the fact that SWGLA membership is free for this year. All of our Bringing Meat to Market courses are included in that membership. You have access to recordings and materials as a member. So I really encourage you all to check that out. As part of this presentation today, you'll be added to SWGLA's email list. You can then be kept abreast of other opportunities as they come up. So who is this class for? So this class is for emerging producers, people that are really starting up. And it's also for folks that are seasoned and maybe need a little bit of a refresher on things, or more importantly, are able to maybe learn new skills about their processor, working with their processors, or keeping track of their yields, or how to actually maximize their carcass and different cutout styles. So those are some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And we're focusing also a good bit on record keeping as a theme, as well as communication. So quick agenda. We're going to do today a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to go into regulations. We're going to cover cut sheets with Rebecca from MPAN. And then we're going to do some yield and analysis of how to actually record keep from a carcass with a tool that we've developed for SWGLA. And then we're going to have a pretty long breakout discussion if things go according to schedule, so that you all can really interact. And next week, same time, we're going to have Holly from Sunnyside Meats talking about producer relationships and communication and empathy and how to get over some of those obstacles. Brief touch on labeling and certifications, brief touch on inventory management, and a little bit about sales and pricing, and we'll stop there. There's a lot of sales and marketing tools inside of the rest of the SWGLA series as well. So we're not going to cover that today, but we're going to have another long breakout as part of next week. So to kick it off, I just wanted to give you all a brief overview of what is a meat supply chain. And we've got 4 examples here. We've got a local supply chain, a regional, a national, and a global. And this slide is just really showing some the depth of complexity that happens when our meat leaves the ranch, right? Or lack of complexity. And in each of these different steps, what we really want to see is we want to see grass-fed value sing, and we want to be able to communicate that value across every step, which means really intimately getting to know how this supply chain works. So just a note, these horizontal flows do not show when your meat changes hands and ownership. It's just about the steps in the process of getting your product into the hands of the consumer. And so, at every step of the way, there are things that are not included in that little slide. There are things like financials and margins and food safety and marketing and management and people in every single one of those little blocks. And so this is not a direct line from, ranch to consumer, and there's risk involved in each one of those steps. Just a quick example, something like trucking your meat at the wrong temperature, as we know, could bring you to a situation in which you've lost product, and that product has many years of investment in it in a grass-fed system. And so really why we've brought this to the table today is to impress upon you that knowing your supply chain and really intimately understanding what happens post-harvest and those nuances of each step is what operating a meat business is about. And unfortunately, you can't just focus on the farming and ranching part of it and the pre-harvest knowledge, because you risk really wasting those efforts that you've put into land and animal stewardship for so many years. So if that is scary and you don't want to be or do that, then I would encourage you all to think twice about being in the meat business, because the supply chain is just as important as the production chain, I'd say. All right, so we're going to have a little raise your hand moment where I'd like to ask just a couple of folks real quickly. I'm only going to call on maybe 2 of you to point out a single pain point in your supply chain that you are hoping to get some advice or information about today. If you're looking for the raise your hand feature, it is in the participants list. If you click the participants button, you'll see a little list of all of us come up, and then you'll have a raise your hand feature. And hopefully I will be able to see you all too as you raise your hands. So just 2 quick little participant moments, and then we'll move forward. All right, I've got Trudy. And you can unmute yourself and go ahead and talk.
Sorry.
There you go.
There we go. We're still kind of new to the process here. We have lots to learn. Our son is interested in the process here, and we have cow-calf herd. He's working on the process of marketing and moving things out in a local supply chain format here. Our point, I think, probably is right now is record keeping. We're just trying to figure out how to navigate the paperwork side of the territory here to take us forward into the future.
Great. Thank you. Hopefully we'll be able to provide some value for that. I saw another hand, but it went away. I think it was Casey, but maybe Casey, you put down your hand. Anybody else want to share?
Yeah, I did have my hand up.
Cool.
So I would kind of echo what Trudy said. Record keeping across the board, whether in our own work or if I'm consulting, is a pain point for a lot of producers. And then the other one is finding good ranch hands, finding cattlemen rather than cowboys.
Okay, we're not going to get into personnel today, but point taken and noted. And hopefully training your folks on some of this stuff is something that we can help with today. So thank you both for sharing. I appreciate the courageousness. And we're going to go ahead and go into breakout rooms just to have a moment to get to know each other. And here's what you're going to say. Hi, this is my name. This is where I am. This is what I grow, raise, sell, do, and what you would like to learn today. And you're going to be automatically placed into groups of 4 or so. And we will make sure that we prompt you when it's time to switch speaking. So we're going to do 5 minutes in this breakout group, not more. And then we're going to come back to the main room and keep moving. So Tyler, you can go ahead and lit us all up.
Hi, Wendy. We currently have folks in breakout rooms just doing a short introductions. Would you like to join a room, or would you like to hang tight? There's only about 2 minutes left of those.
I will hang tight. I'm trying to get my headphones to work currently.
All right. Thanks so much. Glad you could join us. For those of you just joining us, we're just coming back from Breakout Rooms. Thanks for your patience, and we will keep going here in just a minute. Glad you could join us.
Okay, I think we're all back. Tyler, we're all back or not quite yet?
We should be good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I hope that was fun for everybody and you met somebody new. So we are going to pass the mic and the slides over to Rebecca from the Niche Meat Processors Assistance Network, who is going to be talking about regulations, everyone's favorite topic, and cut sheets and some basics about processing. So I'm going to go ahead, Rebecca, and share my screen, and we'll see if you can use a remote. And if you can't, I will advance slides for you.
All right. Well, while she's queuing that up, I'll just say a little bit about our organization. So NPAN, or the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network, is an extension, a unique extension program housed at Oregon State University. We're called an extension community.
I am so sorry, folks. I hit the wrong button. We're calling everyone back. Thanks for those of you just went ahead and came back already. Rebecca, I am sorry to have cut you off there.
Okay. I don't see Olivia or the slides, but I'll just start talking about what NPAN does while she gets back in. So we're a network of about 1,700 folks that are mostly meat processors and meat producers, as well as like extension meat scientists and NGOs as well that support the niche meat supply chain. And so we just work collaboratively to solve each other's problems, share advice and resources, and help to strengthen and scale up niche meats. So in my line of work, I get a lot of phone calls, emails on a daily basis about regulations and how people can work within the regulations or work around the regulations. And so I'm going to be sharing just some of the basics that you need to know about selling meat and what your different options are. I'm wondering if we can get the slides up here. There we are. Okay. So why don't we
give you, let me try and hand it over to you, Rebecca.
Okay.
You can click through, and if not, I'll do it for you.
Okay. Yeah, it's not letting me advance.
Here we go.
All right. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of your basic options for processing. I'm also going to share a couple handouts, which hopefully you guys all have. Where can I sell my meat? And then we're going to talk about cut sheets as well. So why don't let's see. I don't think I can actually click on those handouts. No, it's not giving me a hyperlink. No big deal. We'll just move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what the key regulations are. So the key regulations that govern meat processing include the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, the Poultry Products Inspection Act of 1957, the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act in 1978, and all of those acts have been revised and updated a few times since then. But basically, the FMIA is the overall act that says for meat to be sold into commerce, it must be slaughtered and processed under some form of inspection. So there is federal inspection, which is done by USDA Food Safety Inspection Service, also known as FSIS. There is state inspection, and currently 28 states have state meat inspection. New Mexico is not one of them. And there are very few states in the West that have state meat inspection. I think Arizona, Montana, Oregon just added a new program that I actually help work on a little bit. But otherwise, there's federal inspection in New Mexico, or what's known as custom exempt slaughter, which I'll go into a little bit more in a future slide. So the FMIA is the law that makes it illegal to adulterate or misbrand meat and meat products being sold as food, and ensures that meat and meat products are slaughtered and processed under strictly regulated sanitary conditions. These requirements also apply to imported meat products, which must be inspected under equivalent foreign standards. As well, FSIS also inspects poultry slaughter. However, I'm not going to go into it in great detail since most of our attendees raise ruminants, but there is an exemption to the PPIA that allows for on-farm slaughter of up to 20,000 birds a year without bird-by-bird inspection. So that means there doesn't have to be an inspector standing there watching you kill every bird. And those rules generally allow you to sell only direct to the end user and also within your state. I'm not exactly sure how New Mexico interprets that law. Every state interprets it a little differently, and some of them have stricter rules, such as only allowing up to 1,000 birds a year without inspection. But I did see in the chat there was a couple folks that that do raise poultry, so we could talk more about poultry in the Q&A if you'd like. And then the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act is a law that is designed to decrease suffering of livestock during slaughter. The most notable of the requirements of that law is the need to have an animal completely sedated and insensible to pain, despite, and then I should also say, despite not having continuous inspection, custom exempt plants are still supposed to follow all of these laws. So it's a custom exempt plant is still required to follow all the regulations of FMIA, PPIA, and HMSA, even though there's not an inspector standing there and their records are not checked. Generally, they are checked by their state departments of agriculture like once a year. Very different than having continuous daily inspection. So let's go on to the next slide. So what is inspection? You have ante-mortem inspection, which is an inspector sees the live animal, either by the individual animal or by the lot. So if in the case of like poultry, they'll generally look at lots of birds rather than individual birds. And they're just looking for visual cues that the animal is healthy and disease-free and it's able to stand on its own. Animals that are considered non-ambulatory are no longer fit for human consumption. So those animals will be diverted out of the food supply chain. But the idea is just to visually check every live animal before it's killed. And then they watch to see if the slaughter or if the handling of the animal into the kill box or knock box is humane, as long it's not slipping, it's not catching on anything. And then it is killed on the first shot or rendered insensible on the first shot. or stun. And they're incredibly strict about that. If you have to use more than one shot or more than one stun, then they typically tag your knockbox and shut you down for the day. Sometimes it takes a couple of days to get back up and operating because you have to submit a plan of action, of corrective action to FSIS on how you will make sure that never happens again. So that makes it incredibly hard to operate these plants, and also one of the reasons why I did notice some people were interested in mobile slaughter. One of the reasons why mobile slaughter is also incredibly difficult because most farms and ranches do not have good handling facilities and they don't have knock boxes. And so to be able to kill an animal correctly on the first shot is more challenging in a farm environment. And then next thing is post-mortem inspection. And that begins at stunning and ends at the step where the carcass is placed into the cooler. So they'll look at the carcass, they'll generally inspect the organs. Sometimes they'll inspect the brain. And yeah, they're just looking at evidence of disease, of parasites, and other visual cues that animal was healthy or not. And then after that, they require residue pathogen and microbial testing, and the requirements vary by species and by what kind of further processing you're doing. But they give you sort of a regular testing protocol that you have to follow, and you have to submit tests to their lab or their approved lab. And if the tests come back showing excess residues, pathogens, or microbes, then you have to take corrective action. So that's basically what inspection looks like. In terms of the post-mortem, I should say that also includes the cut and wrap. And cut and wrap inspection is not all day long inspection. Usually an inspector just comes in once a day while you're doing fabrication, maybe for an hour or so, and just looks at your records and make sure you're labeling things properly, you're segregating product properly, and you're keeping good records. All right, next slide. So because New Mexico just basically has these two forms of inspection or processing regulations, I'm just going to cover the two. So there's custom exempt, and that means on the hoof sales only. So that would be selling a whole animal or halves or quarters. Your buyer pre-buys that animal, either the whole animal, half or quarter, and most states don't limit how many buyers can go in on an animal. There are a few states that actually have rules about that. I don't think New Mexico does, because they tend to not have a whole lot of rules about much of anything. So you probably could, go as low as eighths if you want, but it does start to get a little tricky when you're trying to separate up an animal into portions much smaller than that. So that means that the person pre-owns the animal, and the slaughter and the cut and wrap they are paying for, and it's a service that they, as the new owner of the animal, are paying for. So this doesn't allow any wholesaling of that meat. You can't sell at farmers markets, restaurants. Again, those plants still have to follow all of the state law in handling for those animals. And I'll describe custom exempt a little bit in more detail in a future slide. And then USDA, that allows for all options for selling that meat, including crossing state lines. So it requires a USDA slaughter and a stamp of the carcass and a stamp on the label. And the USDA has to approve your label, which can be a really lengthy, fun process. It's best to keep your label as simple as possible, unless you're planning on having that meat sit on retail store shelves where a pretty label is super important. Otherwise, it's best to keep most of the language, like all the different production practices, off the label if you can, and just use other forms of marketing communication to communicate those practices rather than have it be on the label, unless you want to wait months and months and months and submit copious quantities of paperwork to prove that you are doing all those things. So next slide. So the guidance for custom exempt meat, Fsis just produced, well, a couple years ago, produced this new guideline for determining whether livestock slaughter or processing is exempt from inspection requirements of the FMIA. I highly recommend, if you are doing any custom exempt processing and selling locker meat, wholes, halves, and quarters, that you get very familiar with this document, and that you definitely print yourself up a copy, because it gives you all the rules. And next slide. This one in particular, I want to highlight from page 7 in that guidance document. It says carcasses and other products of custom slaughter are not eligible to be sold. Therefore, sale or purchase of the live animal using the service of a custom exempt operator would be based on live weight, price per head, or other quantity pertaining to the live animal. The custom exempt operator can only charge the owner a service fee for the livestock slaughtered or prepared on a custom basis, not for the meat food product itself, which is derived from the custom slaughter or processing, because the custom exempt operator does not own the live animal nor the resultant product. Okay, so that may sound a little bit confusing, but what's important to note is that when you are selling custom exempt animals, you are selling an animal, you are not selling meat. Therefore, you shouldn't be charging based on the hanging weight of that animal, because that is a carcass. That is not a live animal. So I see a lot of farmers do that, and I understand why, because they get a nice precise weight. It makes it much easier to sell based on the real weight of the animal. But technically, according to this guidance, you should be selling based on the live weight of that animal. If you don't have a scale, that makes it a little challenging, or some sort of price per head, which also is challenging because each animal is, different, or some other quantity pertaining to the live animal. So I'm just going to give an example. Say you have a 300-pound live weight pig, and it hangs at, I don't know, 164 pounds or something like that. You would not be charging the new owner of that animal based on that 164-pound hanging weight. You would be charging them based on the 300-pound live weight. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on. So payment from the customer to the rancher should take place prior to slaughter in order to ensure clear status of the ownership. So say 4 families go in on an animal. They could each put a deposit down, and then you could charge them the remainder of what they owe after the animal's killed. That's one way to go about doing it. You could create some sort of, one-page contract where your customers are buying, lamb number 25, and they're buying a half of lamb number 25 and giving you $50 ahead of time prior to slaughter. That's how we used to do it when we raised pigs and sold custom exempt pigs as halves and wholes. But come up with some sort of system to receive payment prior to the slaughter for the whole animal or a portion of the animal. And then payment for slaughter, as well as the cut and wrap services, should be transacted between the customer and the service provider. So your customer is not paying you, the farmer, for the slaughter and the cut and wrap. You should not roll that into your pricing. I see a lot of farmers try to do that. They should pay for that separately, and they should pay directly to that service provider. So if you have a mobile slaughter truck come out, say it's $100 to kill a beef, and you have 2 families going in on it, they should each pay $50 to have that animal slaughtered. And the cut and wrap, they should pay the butcher directly when they go pick up the meat. They should pay their portion of it, either if it's a half or whole or quarter. They should be paying for that directly, and they should be directing the cutting instructions as well. You should not be doing that. You can certainly give them sample cutting instructions that we'll look at later, and maybe give a little advice about how you could recommend getting it butchered, especially for newbies who don't know how to buy meat. But you should not be directing the cutting instructions. That should be, you should give the phone number of the butcher to your customer. They should make that phone call and they should direct the cutting. All right. Let's see. So people who provide custom exempt slaughter and processing must keep detailed records. Of course, all the animals slaughtered must be healthy and fit for human consumption. They must be killed according to humane methods of livestock slaughter. So if you have a mobile kill truck out on your farm and it takes them 6 shots to put down an animal, they are not in compliance with with Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. So just letting you know, even though nobody's there to watch them, they're not following federal law there. That's definitely considered inhumane. All facilities should be maintained in sanitary conditions. So if you have a kill truck that comes out and they're putting animals in 55-gallon drums, say they're putting the carcasses in a 55-gallon drum and then driving around to 4 other farms that day, and it's a warm day and it's going to be about 8 hours before they bring it to the butcher shop, that's not sanitary conditions. So you should definitely check your mobile kill trucks to make sure they're handling your animals in a sanitary way. Otherwise, you're going to have some unhappy customers. And all products must be labeled not for sale. That's what happens at the butcher shop. And any custom exempt product must be kept separate by time or space from product that is for sale. So if you have a bunch of not for sale meat in your butcher shop and you have some inspected meat in your butcher shop, it all has to be kept segregated. All right, next slide. So there's
Rebecca, we're gonna.
Yeah, am I running over?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
So
okay,
we'll move a little bit quicker and take a little bit less time for Q&A, but we're
all
okay.
Right. Well, I just wanted to cover one more unique option for those of you that maybe like to do butchering and want to capture more value, more consumer dollar rather than paying a processor. There's this other option called retail exempt. So it allows a meat processor to sell meat at its own retail storefront or direct to consumer via other methods such as farmers markets or restaurants without developing a HACCP plan, that's a food safety plan, or being inspected daily by Fsis. So what that requires though is that the animal was killed under USDA inspection. You have a stamped carcass and that you can bring those primals or that carcass back to a licensed commercial kitchen or a licensed butcher shop, have proper food handling permits and all of that. And you can do your own cutting there without an inspector standing over your shoulder, and you can sell direct to the end user. It also allows for a limited amount of wholesaling. So I know quite a few farmers now who are selling meat at farmers markets under retail exempt, and they're doing all their own butchering. They just rent a commercial kitchen space and they do their own processing, and it's fun for them. They get to make fun stuff like interesting seasonal sausages and stuff like that. So it allows you to do all of those things listed on this slide. Next slide. So I think I don't need to go over these, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is mostly what you talked about. These are just some diagrams from California that look at how you know where you're selling both your carcass and your meat. So you guys will all receive the PDF presentation in the virtual conference area and take a look at those so we can keep moving forward. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share a little bit about how to find a good processor. Personal references are really important. Talk to other producers, find out who they like. There's also state meat processor associations, and they usually have directories. The USDA Fsis has a meat and poultry inspection directory, and you can actually, they have a searchable map function now, so you can search by animal species, whether they do slaughter only or cut and wrap only or both. narrow down what services you need, and then call those processors that you found. Phone calls is typically how they still operate. Most of them are not on the computer all day. You also need to realize many of these facilities are privately held and they don't do any co-packing. Co-packing is the technical term for processing for farmers on a fee-for-service basis. And then don't be offended if they say no. Just move on to the next one on your list. You can move on. And here's a little map. Oh, here's a little map on the USDA FSIS and Meat and Poultry Inspection website. And so here I plugged in beef slaughter in New Mexico, and there are only 5 facilities that came up. So that's all you got in your state. Next slide. And so we included this in your handout. So I probably don't need to go into all of them, but these are just some really handy questions to ask when you are calling processors and interviewing them about what services they offer, what kind of inspection they utilize, what is their scheduling process, how many animals, what are their costs. It's really important that you do your due diligence and you ask all these questions ahead of time so that you are not, you don't find yourself in a situation with unmet expectations or any sort of miscommunication. Next slide. And then here's a bunch more. And you want to move into some cut sheet examples. So everyone got a handout, several pages of sample cut sheets that we found from a few different processors. And so it's really important for you to familiarize yourself with your animal carcass and what are the different primals and subprimals. Here we have a beef carcass. And then most cut sheets are organized by those primals. So, you've got your chuck, your shank, your rib, your short plate, your short loin, your flank, your sirloin, your round. And then from there, you break it down even further into, what roast do you want? Do you want steaks? Do you want stew meat? Do you want grind? This one right here on the slide is not very detailed, and more detailed is better so that you don't have miscommunication and you don't get back product that you didn't exactly want. So in the other handouts, maybe we could go on to the next slide. This one's a little hard to see, but it is in your handouts. So this one talks about, this is a pork cut sheet. Let me look at it. Anyway, it'll ask you how big you want your roast to be. Do you want bone in or boneless? How thick you want your steaks to be, 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch? Do you want your tenderloin left whole or sliced? Do you want your jowls whole or sliced? Do you want your trimmings made into stew meat or ground? And what size packs you want in terms of poundage. So, and then typically, under special instructions or somewhere on the cutting sheet, it'll also ask you if you want organ meats back. Some processors can save blood if you have a market for blood. I know some restaurants and chefs make boudin noir, and there might be a market for blood. Oxtails, the heads. This is especially important for pigs because there's a lot of saleable meat on the head. Yeah, so, and I should say bones and fat as well. So your fat, you can choose to have your fat packaged up into, packages of like 5 to 10 pounds of just pure fat. If you have a market for fat, don't get things packaged if you don't have a market for it. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting on it in your freezer for months and months. Or you can have a lot of that fat made into your various sausage products and ground products. So that's also a good place to divert a lot of fat. Most processors are not able to render fat, but you could render your own fat in a commercial kitchen if you want to go that route. What else should I say? Yeah, bones. Again, with bones, you can choose to leave them in the cuts, which is what I usually recommend because you get a lot more money for them. Or you can have them segregate out the bones and make packages of bones that people can make their own stock or use for their pets, etc. But anytime you don't give those instructions to your processor about the organ meats, the bones, the fat, the heads, you generally won't get those products back then if you don't ask for them. And that is how the processors often make a lot, not a lot, but make some money off of that animal apart from processing. That's often known as the drop credit, which also often includes the hides. So if you don't ask for them back, you're not going to get them back, and you're going to lose value on your animals. So don't complain if you don't get them back when you didn't tell them you want them. So I get a little annoyed by hearing farmers complain about low yields or not getting certain things back. And I say, well, did you put them on your cutting instructions? Well, no, I just assumed. Yeah, don't assume. Always be really clear. And then the last thing I'm going to say, which I think Holly is going to stress next week, is that the more complicated you make your cutting instructions, the more opportunity for error that there is with your processor, the more of a headache that you are for your processor. If you're a large volume customer for your processor, they may be willing to get fancy where they're cutting for you. If you're a low volume customer for them, don't make their life miserable by being like, well, this lamb I want done this way, this lamb I want done this way, this lamb I want done this way. Like, no, that's not going to make for a happy processor. Most of them will just say, I don't have time on the schedule for you. Likewise, you need a certain amount of meat to make different sausages. And so you can't be like, oh, 5 pounds of this animal, make into this sausage, 5 pounds of this, 5 pounds. You know, they're not going to do that either. They have minimum orders for grind and sausage. So yeah, the more complexity, the more chance for error. And that's all I have to say. Let's go into questions.
Yeah, so let's take about 5 minutes, 4 minutes for questions. For Rebecca, you can either raise your hand and we'll see that and we'll call on you and you can talk like a human, or you can chat it into the chat box, whatever you prefer. So we have a question from Lori.
Can you take, say, 10 lambs and tell the processor that you want X amount of pounds of burger, X amount of pounds of kebabs, you know, X amount of pounds of something else? Can they combine those lambs if you're doing it with a label, you know, with a resale label? You understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, they can combine your animals to make grind and kebab meat and sausage and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. That's typical within your lot of animals that you bring in.
Okay, so you don't have to just do it per animal cut.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And that's typically what they do on lamb anyway, especially if you want grind or kebab meat, because there's so little per animal.
Yeah.
Yeah. They'll typically cut, you know, kill them all in a day, cut them all up in a day, fill up a bunch of totes with all your trim meat, and then grind it, make sausage, whatever.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and just to clarify there, it's easier for the processor if you're cutting uniformly across multiple animals. If you're taking a small load, it's much better for them. As Rebecca said, it's much less complex if you want them all cut the same way and you want some of those cuts even combined into grind or value added products. That's ideal for them. So okay, so Mary has a question.
Would you consider, like, you know, a reasonable amount of popped cryo that you would get back from a processor? And how would you handle talking to the processor about the popped cryo? Like, what would be a reasonable request, you know, as us from a producer to, you know, to fix the situation? It varies a lot. We have some processors, I have one processor that we've been working with for like years, and I haven't had one popped cryo from them. But they're also very particular, and like we're very limited in what we can do. Like they're you basically, you know, have a couple different options on your cut sheet, but you get what you get. But with our processors that are really great to work with, that gave us lots of options, like we've had issues with multiple processors where we get a pretty substantial amount of popped cryo in some of, especially the larger cuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would just approach it like, you know, hey, we really love working with you. We love the quality of your work. We're having some challenges with the packaging and the integrity of the packaging, and wondered what we might be able to do about it. If you need to make your cuts smaller, your roast smaller, do you need to use bone guards? Do you need to move to boneless to get the bone out of there? You know, what's the issue? Do they need a new cryovac machine? Is there some way you could support them or finance a new cryo machine for them? So just approach it more like, you know, I want to help you have a better quality product, and it would be a win-win for both of us that it would go that way. So, yeah.
And Mary, we're going to talk a lot more about those hard conversations and creative solutions next week. That's going to be, not that this is an inappropriate question, but that's kind of the focus of the first half of next week's session.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So stay tuned for that one. And we're going to take one more question that was typed in. Why do few processors deal with tallow? Is it information or economics?
So it requires what's called a steam kettle. So it's a piece of expensive equipment. It's time consuming. You know, you generally have to dedicate a staff person to keep an eye on it and stir it. And there's just not a lot of demand for it. So most processors just don't buy the equipment, don't make the space for it, don't want to deal with it because not enough producers are asking for it. So I'd say those are your main hurdles with tallow.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Rebecca. And we have, we'll make sure to give out Rebecca's email address. Rebecca, why don't you type it into the chat too as well? It's in the end of the presentation, but feel free to direct more questions to her over the course of the next week as they come up. And we're gonna keep on going here. So our next section is all about yield and analysis. And so I am going to actually introduce something that we created for SWGLA that is about tracking your carcass yield. But first, we're going to talk about some major concepts of meat processing. And just give me a second while I reorganized my things on my screen here. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to go over some terminology so we're all on the same page. And this is some of the lingo that maybe gets a little bit intimidating. And let's try and debunk that intimidation. So yield, what's yield? Again, we're catering this workshop to a number of different producers at all different stages. So for some of you, this might be a little bit of a review, but stick with us. So yield, the amount of saleable product generated from a carcass. And what we also are referring to most of the time is maximizing that yield, right? Maximizing how many cuts we can get off of that carcass or that primal to actually make money. Shrink is a loss of product or value. It can come from a number of different places, not just from a faulty processor's set of activities. And it's a pretty generic term. Carcass utilization is selling all the parts of the animal, right? Or just getting the most out of the animal, getting the most out of what you've got into it. And value added, which is increasing the value of a cut or a product. And that can be by turning it, usually we're referring it to value added when we're transforming it into something else. So a little bit about industry norms on yield here. This is just kind of a basic chart of what you get off of an animal in a grain-fed or grass-fed situation. Again, these are total general averages, and we're going to talk a lot about why maybe these are useful and maybe they're not so useful. But to give you a benchmark of what you get from a live animal to your hot carcass weight, right? Once it's eviscerated, basically. And then once it's fabricated, the actual number of pounds that you get off of that animal. So this is an area when you're selling through a custom exempt scenario. Again, you're potentially selling on the live animal to customers. They are paying the butcher for hot carcass weight, a per pound processing fee on hot carcass weight, but then they get back a different number of cuts, which may be very familiar to you and not as familiar to them. So we're going to get into communication about how to do that a little bit more in next week. But from here, I'd like to take those numbers with a grain of salt and move into understanding that your yield numbers are really what the norm is. So how do we get your numbers? We start to record them. You start to track your harvests, your animals with our tool or anyone's tool, and then you create your benchmark. This is really something I can't stress enough, and we're going to spend 20 minutes on it. So knowing the norms and recording every harvest is how you can improve your own capacity to analyze what's happening in your operation. And this starts by knowing your cost of production, for sure. Again, we're not going to go into it today, but we have a webinar on it. And it ends with good record keeping on what comes out of that harvest, down to every little last ounce and gram and cut. So we've got the cost of production webinar again. We've got two. We've got an overview on concepts and then a deep dive with a special little cost of production tool. There are lots of tools out there, but so I just suggest you use something, even if it's the back of a napkin. So a little bit more about definitions on the more detailed level. Your yield standard is the percentage of weight that you can expect from your animals. That's what we use to forecast, right? Again, we're going to start to collect our own data and use our own standard. The tree, your yield tree, is actually the sort of spreadsheet of your cuts and their yields in pounds. A test is actually weighing all of those parts to look at the percentage of each cut against the hanging weight, cut being a subprimal or an actual cut. And red meat yield is what we consider all of the sellable red meat items, whether they're bone-in or boneless, and all trim that's 50% or leaner. Your red meat yield is going to vary greatly whether you decide to keep the bone in the animal, in the cut, as Rebecca said, or you're going to leave it on the table. Your fabrication drop is essentially your fat and bones that are not included in the red meat yield. So the stuff that you don't use in a value-added product, in your grind, or in a cut. And your slaughter drop is essentially the difference between your live weight and your carcass weight. It's what you don't take. The hide, the head, the blood, the viscera, the offal. You might actually ask for and get some of those items back, but technically that's what's called a slaughter drop. So I'm going to stop this presentation. I'm going to go over to a spreadsheet and we're going to breeze through what we call our yield and margin calculator. I'm going to do this pretty quickly. We have an hour-and-a-half long, very in-depth, very slow webinar on how to use this tool. But I wanted to introduce it to you today, not just to sort of toot our own horn as SWGLA and the resources we've created, but just to show you the kinds of things that we should be tracking for. So take a deep breath. Don't feel like you have to absorb everything that I'm saying right now, because you can become a SWGLA member and go learn it in a different webinar in a detailed fashion. So give me one sec. I'm going to go to a different screen. Okay, so here we are in our cute little tool. And again, hold your questions till the end of this section if you can. So we have a pretty extensive little instructions page here. It just tells you how to use every different tab, and it shows you a little bit about what some of the formulas mean. So let's hop over to our harvest tracker cuts page. So this tool is powered by dates. We're going to start by entering our harvest date up at the top. And every harvest date can be, should be tracked separately, and it can either be for a single animal or a load. So you can put a number of different animals here, number of head, and the total live weight and total hot carcass weight for the whole load if you're doing multiple harvests. You don't have to distinguish it in any other way. So then those are our first two data points, right? So then we're going to go down and enter, we're going to skip this gray part right here because gray on our tool is formulas and are automatically populated, while blue is where we enter. And we're going to scroll down here to our yield numbers and look at individual cuts, right? So here is where we enter essentially our cut sheet. All the cuts we've decided to take from our processor, or in a hypothetical situation, the cuts we're thinking about taking, because we're going to be measuring what we get off of the whole animal and what we get per cut in terms of both weight and margin and dollars. And so everything goes in here separated by primal, and all the way down here at line 89, we're going to see a red meat total, which includes our trim, right? So that is all bone in and boneless, but again, that will deeply affect what this number is, right? So then we have our fab drop, which is fat and bones. Again, these are sellable items. You have to ask for them, but you can also sell them. And then we have our slaughter drop, which is essentially any organs or anything you get back, like the head or the hide. So this is where we keep track of an animal if we're going to fabricate it into cuts. So then let's hop over to this other tab that we have. It looks exactly the same. It is a separate place to record if you cut your animal into whole or partial carcasses. It is designed exactly the same way, except for obviously it doesn't have cuts. It has eighths, quarters, and halves listed here. And you would put the total poundage that you're getting back in those, in those quarter pieces from your harvest. And then any organs that you're getting back. So then let's hop over to where it gets exciting, which is the margin calculator. So up at the top here, we've got a place to insert date ranges. And this is how this tool really starts to flex. You can look at a single date range, as I've done right here, which is linked to, in this example, a single harvest, December 1st, right? Which is a single animal in this example. But what you can also do is then put a different you put a different to and from date and look at a much wider swath of time to start to look at averages across multiple harvests and multiple animals. So again, blue is entry. We're going to drop in here. We have a place to drop in our cost of production. That's coming from a separate style of analysis, and it's based on a per pound live weight basis. Then we've got our slaughter fees and our processing fees that we drop in here. And what we're trying to get to in this information is actually what is the full cost of sellable product. Let me just stretch this out a little bit. Give me a second so you guys can see the edge of this. So our full cost of sellable product is not what you pay for processing. It's not what you pay to raise the animal. It is actually both of those and divided by the actual amount of sellable product that you get back. So not just the hanging weight that you paid for processing, but all the meats that you get back. And that's how we get that full cost per pound of sellable product. Again, I know I'm going super fast, but I just want to give you a brief overview of what this thing does. We're going to come back up here to these areas in bold in just a minute and go down to our per cut metrics. So all these cuts here on the left are powered by what we put in to our harvest tracker cuts page, our cut sheet, right? But here on the right, we get to put in our potential pricing. So this is where things get really exciting, right? So if we're looking at what you are charging a customer, whether you are in a direct DTC, direct to consumer scenario, or in a wholesale scenario, we are going to then also enter the margin that you might pay that other reseller. and then be able to analyze what your margin per cut is. So again, you look over here on the left, we've got our cuts, and then we've got a margin per cut based on the price that I put in on the right, the margin that somebody takes out, and our true cost per pound for this animal or group or date range, right? So this allows us to start to look at what we're making on every single cut. Hopefully I haven't lost y'all yet. So let's go back up to the per head metrics now and look at what this tells us. We've entered in all our cuts, we've entered in our pricing, and we've got a weighted average price per pound that we have determined for all of our cuts on the whole carcass. Now, just a refresher from 7th grade math, weighted average is not a simple average, but it is, for example, if I have a $4 price and an $8 price, a simple average would be $6, right? A weighted average is how many cuts do I actually sell at $8 and how many cuts do I actually sell at $4. So it will weight my average heavier towards whatever the larger number of cuts at whatever price I have. So this is a more accurate way of looking at what my average price per pound is. So then underneath it, I've got a resulting internal margin, a percentage on the animal that I'm going to make. One important point here is that this chart does not take into account inventory that you have not sold. So it's assuming you sell all of the cuts. Now that's a whole different scenario in terms of how you create marketing opportunities for all those cuts. But if you sell the whole animal, when you move all that product, this is what you'll be making off of the animal. And it shows you that in terms of a margin percentage and a dollar amount per head. So how do we flex this margin calculator? There's a couple of different ways that we can actually use it. So we can actually duplicate this tab to test for different sales channels. So I'm inserting different prices here, right? So let's say I want to test a farmer's market scenario versus a wholesale scenario. I would duplicate this tab, name one farmer's market, name another one wholesaler, and put in a different set of pricing. I would link the dates to my example animal if I was just hypothetically looking at what an animal might get me. So same date, same single animal, same hanging weight, same live weight, and same cutout, and look at what I'm going to make per head in those two sales scenarios. Similarly, you can look at a whole carcass in cuts versus a whole carcass broken down just into quarters or halves right up here at the top, because I've got this area to put in a single animal on my cuts page. I can put the same animal on my whole or partial carcass as I've done here in December 1st. It's exactly the same weight. It's the same animal. And I go over to my margin calculator and it tells me what I would get out of that animal if I cut it up with my preferences according to a cut sheet, of course, which is a whole other set of variables, or if I just break it into quarters, let's say. So again, we've got two different sets of margins, and we've got two different sets of profit, right? We've got two different amounts of money that we'll get back. But what I urge you to consider is that, great, this $2,000 looks awesome, but I have to have a market for all of those cuts. If I don't have a market for all of those cuts, they're sitting in my freezer. If they're sitting in my freezer, it's like money sitting in the freezer. So you might look at this and say, oh, I'm going to just for sure fabricate all of my animals. But if you don't have a route to actually get rid of all of that, and you don't have the energy or the time or the capacity, I encourage you to get those things as a person that runs a meat business. Again, not the focus of today, but remember that you also have that choice, and you can just sell quarters and eat that margin and be happy if that's what life chooses you. But I encourage you not to leave that money on the table and go ahead and make the market for all of those cuts. So another way that we can flex this margin calculator is actually to look at different butchering styles. So let's say we want to test one cutout versus a different cutout and see what it's going to make us. We would essentially do a similar thing. We would put the same animal in the harvest tracker cuts page with two different dates and two different cutouts, right? So I've got all my cuts here, but one animal would have, a certain amount of tenderloin, for example, and another animal, the other hypothetical animal would have, porterhouses on it where I wouldn't break out the tenderloin. And if I then come over to the margin calculator, I can duplicate that page again, put the same date in, and see what those two different breakouts will actually get me. So all this is explained in our webinar, but I wanted to make sure today we went over what it can do for you. And essentially, the most important thing about this is really looking at this date range up at the top. Let's look at a year. Let's look at 2 years. Let's look at hundreds of animals to be able to understand what is your average hanging weight over time? What is your average dressing percentage over time? What is your weighted average price over time? These things are your benchmarks that are deeply more important than any industry standards that we can give you on a little handout from Extension. And, it gives you simple analysis alongside some deeper analysis in terms of like margin per cut. So that is our yield and margin calculator. I know that was crazy fast, and I appreciate everybody's patience and flexing your brain muscles in new ways. And again, if you become a SWGLA member, you can get access to the webinar and the tool itself, and potentially some technical assistance on how to use it. So SWGLA also offers technical assistance with me and my colleague Anjali for financials, and I encourage you guys to think about taking advantage of that opportunity. And I'm going to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A here, and I'm going to ask that you all keep your questions about yield Q&A kind of on the bigger picture. Because we didn't go deep into this tool, I don't want to get too in the weeds about the details of the tool, but I want to attack questions on yield and margin in general. So raise your hand, type it in. I am ready to call on you for these questions, or just breathe deeply. All right, Kevin.
Okay, to bring this one step further, is there a way to, all right, we're small operation, but if you want to, like for what sire you used, or what out of what cow, or that, like I say, to go one step back and
in terms of like tracking your genetics.
Correct.
So we've had this question before, and what I would actually suggest people doing is making notes in the top. Here, I'm going to go back to the screen share real quick just to show you where, Kevin, I'm talking about. So you've got this spot right here up at the top for the date. Underneath in this area, we've suggested just keeping your notes on who that is. So put in a name, right? And if you need more lines, you can add more lines to add more details. If you need more information here, it's not going to track your whole genetic line, obviously. But if you need to remember who that is, that's how we've suggested doing it in the past. Does that make sense? Does that answer your need?
Maybe.
It doesn't have a way. You could build in more complexity if you have somebody on your team that is a little bit of an Excel whiz, where then you could sort those dates by the genetics that they're coming from, or sort those harvests by their genetics, right? And reorder them. And then you'd be looking at a swath of the chart that would give you just the selection of what you're looking for. And you can do that with the date range on the margin calculator page right now. So it's workable for what you want in a limited fashion, I'd say.
Because then we could even adding to that is the age of the animal. like we'll harvest at between 22 and 30 months usually.
Right, right. So it wouldn't be very hard to augment this Excel spreadsheet. And I've had a number of people do that, take this and kind of like whoop it up into even more complicated thing, where you're going to be entering those details, and then you would sort for those details, and you would then sort for a selection of those details on the margin calculator page and be able to see those metrics for just that, that selection. So that's not too hard for somebody that is good at Excel.
That's not me.
But if be in touch if you have more questions about how to kind of go down that route, I'd say.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So I've got a question from Kathy in the chat that says, if you use different processors, can you still use or do multi-year yield calculations? It's a great question. We actually designed it for that same hope, that you would be able to look at the results from different processors. What I would actually suggest is creating a copy of one of the entire spreadsheet that's one processor, and then keeping another copy that's the other processor, unless you happen to know the break of when. If you know when you're working with them, obviously you can do it according to the date range and just remember the results that you get. So let's say I work with processor A from January to December. I put in that date range, I get my metrics, and I take a note of them, even adding a tab, a summary tab. And then I know that from December to February, I switched processors. I do that date range, I look at the metrics, and I take a note of it. So you can build onto this however you need to. It might be easier to just track different processors with different spreadsheets. The disadvantage of doing that is that then let's say you want to look across 5 years, you have to recombine them again. In which case, the important data is really about those animals. So I would suggest selecting for date and then keeping track on creating another tab to keep track. And Mary.
Hi. Okay, so I have a question about the sheet again. I know you said we're not going to get into it that much, but for the animals, like if you have 10 head or more or less, like can you put in the cuts for each one of those animals, and then it goes into like a summary of the entire lot, and that pulls it into that date, or how does that work?
So if you take 10 animals and you cut them different ways, let's say you cut them 10 different ways, is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I mean, I'm just, if can you enter, is there the capacity in the sheet if you were to enter each animal, just so you have the yield of each animal, and then
that's exactly what it's meant to do.
Oh,
you can group it if you want to. If you take 10, you just enter 10 and you cut them all out in the same way, then you put them in one column. If you take one at a time or two at a time, then each load of 1 or 2 becomes a different column. So it's you don't have to do anything except for enter the number of head at the top and the number of the total number of pounds that you actually are working with. So yeah, that's exactly how we designed it. So it could flex both ways, let's say. And I wanted to mention one other thing. We actually built out this tool after the fact as a result of the webinar that we did with it in May. We then got a request from a number of producers to build it out for other animals. So we do have lamb and goat, which is super exciting. And we also do have pig. We do not have chicken, but we have lamb and goat together, and we have pig. So if anybody needs those tools, again, become a SWGLA member. It's free, and then you get them. So let's take one more question. Emily has written in, what advice would you have for producers looking for processing facilities in New Mexico, where processing facilities are few and far between, are booked up for the next year? So it's $1 million question. It's not a New Mexico centric question. Everyone in the whole country has that question. And there is no easy answer. You pretty much have to deal with what you have. So as Rebecca showed that map, I think making sure that you know what your options are and developing, investing in relationships with folks that you do have access to with kindness and empathy. That is what we're going to talk about next week. And getting on the wait list or getting off of the wait list, I think is probably one of the hardest things about being a meat producer in the United States right now. The processing bottleneck is not something, unfortunately, that we can solve in this webinar. And besides being good to the people that you are looking to develop relationships with, that is advice I have. I'm curious if Rebecca, you want to jump in here and say anything about how to route this, not so easy route through this path.
Yeah. So a couple of things. A lot of the bottleneck is in the cut and wrap, and it's not in the slaughter. And that is because a lot more product is having to be cut into retail ready meat, because meat has shifted to grocery stores and out of restaurants and food service where it was cut into primals. So it's a lot more labor intensive, which means the cut and wrap is where the bottleneck is, because they don't have enough labor, and most of these small plants don't have enough employees to do that detailed level of cutting. So you might be able to find a plant that can do slaughter only for you, because they have enough capacity to do the slaughter, and then take the carcasses somewhere else. Potentially look into the retail exempt option, where you rent a commercial kitchen and you do your own cutting. Or you may have to pick up carcasses and take them to another facility that does just cut and wrap only. So that list that I showed you that is slaughter, that has slaughter, there are plants that just do cut and wrap only. And so sometimes you may have to facilitate transporting those carcasses. Another option is if you're raising under 20 head a year, you should probably be doing them all custom exempt halves and wholes anyway. You make more money on that. You spend less money on marketing. You don't have to hold inventory, and there are a lot more custom exempt shops. So that's my advice.
Thanks, Rebecca. I have one more piece of advice. If you are not small, or if you are starting small and you're planning on scaling, I encourage you to get involved in your local policy in any way, because these needs need to be heard. And it is our job to continue to participate on that end. I know we all have so much to do. We're all so busy. You all are busy raising animals and selling meat. Part of that bottleneck is about regulations and policy. There are a number of motions happening right now as a result of COVID inside of changing both state and federal laws around custom exempt processing that I would encourage you all to educate yourselves about and get active and vocal about inside of your communities. So that's my little speech for election week. And it just gets to the larger job of being a producer, which doesn't end just when your animals go to slaughter, I think. So with that, I am going to leave it to you all to chat with each other. I'm going to share my screen again so we can move on. I think I have a couple of other things here that we might just breeze through in terms of yield and margin, and then we're going to break out into groups and talk about things associated with processing. So I think I covered all of this, essentially making your own strategy based on your own numbers. I tend to beat that horse dead so we can breeze through. But these, just a couple of different points that I didn't touch on yet, that tool will help you also really decide what your subprimal cutout looks like and where you want your lean point to be on your grind and how you use your fat. We already touched on the fact that it can help you look at what's happening across different processors, thanks to Kathy's questions. So from here, what we're going to do is break you out again into groups of 4 randomly, do an intro, tell the other folks who you are, what you do, and then I would like you to identify a spokesperson, somebody that is going to share with the group what you all talk about. And we're going to talk today for the next 20-25 minutes. what I did here was try to replace the awesomeness of being in a conference. I've been participating in conferences in Zoom for the last few months, and I really appreciated the time to actually get to know some people outside of just listening to information and watching slides. So I hope you all appreciate this moment to connect with humans, even if they're in little boxes. And what I'd like you to discuss is your top 2 most pressing questions or issues around your processing relationship, whether it's starting it, finding it, keeping it, or living within it. And we're going to do that for about 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And your spokesperson is going to keep notes. You can keep notes in any way you want to, just on a piece of paper. We're actually going to come back into the big room after the breakout and just say goodbye. But the spokesperson is going to bring those notes to the table next week when we start up. This is the hook to get you to come back. And we're going to start our discussion with Holly Zink, processor of Sunnyside Meats, by venting and sharing all the things that we want to talk about. And then we're going to make our way through all the bad stuff and talk about all the good stuff with her. So you can, of course, talk about other things in this breakout group. I encourage you to get to know each other a little bit. Feel free to exchange information. And if you want each other's information as a result of this time together, we can help facilitate that as well. So make sure you each get a time to talk. We'll send you a prompt when you switch, and then we'll come back for just a minute to say goodbye at the end. So away we go, Tyler, into breakout rooms.
Chris, do you need